Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the second HPB symposium that this year is focusing on islet transplantation, cutting-edge treatment both for diabetes mellitus and chronic pancreatitis. Now, Downstate's president, Dr. Riley, has a keen interest in the treatment of diabetic patients for our community here at Downstate. He is not in town today, and I have asked our dean, Dr. Michael Lucchesi, to say a few words on his behalf. Dean Lucchesi.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. So this is a great day, and I want to thank Dr. Gruessner for inviting me. This is fantastic. And I think you're all going to really enjoy this really power-packed, the power-packed speakers that are here. I want to welcome everybody to SUNY Downstate, the only academic medical center in the borough of Brooklyn, a borough that has 2.6 million people in it, a borough that has rampant diabetes and sequelae of diabetes for numerous reasons, an underserved population. And it's really important to have a symposium like this to bring the attention to everyone, not only everyone on campus, but everyone in the borough of Brooklyn and everyone in the city of New York. And so I want you all to enjoy this day. It's really fantastic, and I'll be popping in during the course of the day, and I hope you come away with this realizing the incredible epidemic that we have here in Brooklyn and actually in the country. If you look, diabetes deaths, sequelae from diabetes deaths are between the Bronx and Brooklyn highest of anywhere in New York City, and those numbers rival the state. And in the greatest city in the world, it's just crazy how we have this. So we have to do something about this. We have to do something about our diabetics, and this is a phenomenal opportunity that we have here again in the only academic medical center in the borough of Brooklyn. So enjoy the day.
So just a few brief remarks initially for those that are not familiar with islet transplantation. Islet transplantation can be done as auto islet transplants, meaning using the patient's own islets, or allo-transplantation, where you take the pancreas from a deceased donor and give it to a patient with diabetes. Just a few words about diabetes in general and following up on what the dean just said. 30 million Americans are diabetic, about 2 million are type 1 diabetics. 89 million Americans are pre-diabetic. That means every third of us is or will be pre-diabetic, and every third of that third will eventually develop diabetes. I mean, that the magnitude of it is. We have spent in the last few years $500 billion a year, not billion, $500 billion, almost $500 billion for the treatment of diabetes, much more than we have spent for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan together, and that on an annual basis. Chronic pancreatitis is not as common. The incidence is about 10 to 15 per 100,000. The prevalence is about 50 per 100,000, but it is a disease that is crippling to the patients that end up with it, and we will hear much more about it later today. Islet transplantation has had a major impact also on the field of transplantation itself. It's not a solid organ, and the cellular components and how it interacts with transplant immunology really came to surface over the last 20 years and have also influenced widely the field of solid organ transplantation. You will hear later from some of the speakers that the first xenotransplants that we are planning are not xenotransplants in solid organ transplantation, but in cellular transplantation. So it clearly is an entity that will stay around both from the research point of view as well as from the clinical avenue. The there was a time when pancreas and islet transplantation were considered combined entities. In the 1970s, the International Pancreas and Islet Transplant Registry was founded. Later, it was split into the International Pancreas Transplant Registry, which we still run here from Downstate, and we have about 60,000 transplants worldwide in that registry. Reporting is mandatory from in the United States through UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing, but we also have the data from Japan, from Eurotransplant, from South American countries. It's a wealth of information, and I think the same will happen and continue with the International Islet Transplant Registry. Now, we have assembled some of the leaders in the field, in the nation, and usually, I mean, you will meet them at national or international meeting. It is great that they are here in Brooklyn. I think they all have underestimated how long it takes from Downstate to any of the airports. So some of our invited speakers will have to leave early just to catch their flights in time, because as you all know, we don't have a highway from here to LaGuardia nor to JFK. I think we would need it, but as you all know, it takes sometimes a couple of hours to get back to the airport. Now, I want to pay tribute and homage to the person who started it all, and without whom we may not be here today the way we are. And this is my former teacher and mentor, and then later partner and friend, David Sutherland. David Sutherland is a homegrown Minnesotan. He is still in Minnesota, but he was one of the first ones to, in the second century of the second part of the 20th century, to become one of the great American surgeons. David was the first one to describe what we are talking about over the next couple of hours. The first one to describe total pancreatectomy with islet auto-transplant, meaning taking the cells from an individual and giving it to that person for the purpose of making the patient pain-free and also insulin-independent. Now, this happened in 1977. It took about 20 years until it took roots, and many of the things that he described back then, from the surgical point of view, are still valid today. I'll give you one example. With that procedure, we always try to preserve the spleen. It took another 20, 25 years until Andrew Washoe, the chairman at the MGH, introduced spleen-preserving pancreatectomies for cancer operation. There are many other things that David Sutherland has done during his distinguished career. In 1978, he did the first islet allo-transplants from living donors. Just think about that, going to the IRB these days and proposing to take half of a donor pancreas, living donor pancreas out, and putting those cells with uncertain outcome into a family member. He was also the first one to do living donor pancreas transplants, where he took the tail of the pancreas and transplanted it into one individual. That happened in 1979, and then in the 1990s, we actually did for the first time, combined solid organ transplants, where we removed a kidney and a portion of the pancreas for the sake of a recipient. So David has been instrumental in many, many ways to the field, and many of the speakers today, Paul Robertson was his longtime associate in the field of endocrinology, but others from the University of Minnesota, like Mike Maurer, who could show that some of the diabetic changes over time are reversible if a successful pancreas or islet transplant can be done, or Bill Kennedy, who taught us about the consequences of untreated autonomous and peripheral neuropathy, diabetic neuropathy, and the cure through transplantation, were instrumental in this field, and he really assembled a team of specialists early on in Minneapolis that were dedicated to the treatment of diabetes. In the 1990s, Dr. Bernhard Herring, now one, maybe the leading islet researcher and clinician in the world, joined us in Minnesota, and he will talk later about some of the things that went on over the years in Minnesota. Dr. Milena Berlin, who is running the auto-islet transplant program in children for hereditary pancreatitis and other causes, will also talk to us. And then Dr. Apakalai, who is actually doing the islet isolation for us in Kentucky until we have our own lab. And I can tell you, with the support of the president, the dean, and so forth, we are on a good way to have this established, hopefully, by the beginning of next year. Dr. Apakalai is probably the best isolationist in the country. And I'm saying that with a purpose. I mean, there are many surgeons that can perform a total pancreatectomy successfully, but there are very few people that actually can do successfully an islet isolation. So you will hear from him later. But all of them have in common that they worked, that we all worked with David Sutherland and were inspired by him. This shows you a view of Minneapolis from many years ago. I left Minneapolis in 2007. You can see it on the right side. The Mississippi runs right through it. These are the research buildings. This is the hospital here. And this is how David Sutherland always described himself, planting beta cells for replacement and cure of diabetes in Minneapolis. And we had at some point every 7th pancreas transplant in the world done in Minneapolis. And then here you can see Bernard Herring and David Sutherland with me at a meeting in the probably around 2005. David retired from clinical work in 2011. And here is David again with Paul Robertson. And in the middle is Max Dubernard. It's a very small community. Max Dubernard was a urologist who got involved in pancreas transplantation. And he developed a technique that's called duct injection. As a urologist, he hated the pancreas because of all the terrible pancreatitis complications. So he said we have to get rid of the exocrine pancreas. So he injected polymer into the pancreatic duct to atrophy the organ. Now, he went on actually to become, as a urologist, the first surgeon to do a face transplant, a successful face transplant. You have heard about that patient who subsequently, I think 10 years later, died. And he also was the first one to perform a hand transplant. Now, next year for the 3rd HPB symposium, we will talk about these new cutting things, uterine transplants, face transplants, hand transplants, and so forth. And we will invite Max Dubernard to give a talk. He is also a greater-than-life figure. He became a senator in the French Assembly. He was the mayor of Lyon. Again, I mean, certain people like David Sutherland, I mean, really excel and make things happen that very few individuals can. I will stop here. I have to remind myself that we are a little bit in a time crunch because we have to stop in time today. And I also want to thank our sponsors who made the symposium possible. As you know, academic departments these days are poor departments, and we depend on the support of industry for unrestricted grants. And I would like to thank all of our sponsors to come to our help in that regard and make this symposium possible.